Dan Mogula from the Campus Office of Communications and Public Affairs. Today, we're going to be talking about a set of really interesting findings and figures in the latest poll conducted by Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies. The survey of Californians was conducted in late January and explored, among other things, perceptions of President Biden, Governor Gavin Newsom, Senator Dianne Feinstein, and the political dimensions of the coronavirus in California. Joining us today to help unpack, understand, and analyze the numbers are Cristina Mora, Associate Professor of Sociology, who's also the co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies, and Eric Schickler, Professor of Political Science and the other co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies. As always, we welcome your questions as we go along, and if you do have a query, just post it on the comments section on the YouTube page, and we'll do our best to respond. Eric and Cristina, good to see you guys again. Let's jump right in. So just stepping back, you polled a lot of different areas as I just described. Cristina, let's start with you. What are some of the main takeaways? What are the things you're continuing to think about and mull over that arose from this poll?
Yeah, I think if I could sort of wrap it all up in sort of a, one takeaway, it would be basically that Californians seem quite optimistic about the national picture, especially the working so far of the Biden administration, who's he's elected into or who he's chosen in his cabinet, the direction of the country at the national stage. And at the same time, they are quite cautious and not as optimistic about what's going on here at home. Their perceptions of the governor are on much more shaky ground than what we saw in the summer. And even their perceptions of longstanding figures like Senator Dianne Feinstein, whose numbers are, for the first time since we've been polling, sort of less favorable than favorable for her. And more than anything, the number one thing that seems to be on most Californians' mind is the virus. Whether that be because they're Democrats and they're really concerned about it, or whether that even if they're Republicans and they're really concerned about when business will open up and when we'll stop talking about it, right? And so the virus seems to be the most immediate thing in the context of maybe some national hope and maybe some local and statewide caution, I would say.
Interesting. Eric, where do you, from 30,000 feet, how are you looking at all this?
Yeah, well, I would echo everything Cristina said. I share in, and I guess the one thing I'd add is that we still see, intense polarization by party in California. And so, maybe there've been some talk about whether maybe reactions to Joe Biden will be somewhat less polarized than his predecessor, given his own kind of effort to frame himself as a more bipartisan leader. But I think we see just as high polarization. And I would say that ordinarily helps Democrats or works in Democrats' favor in California because it is such a blue-leaning state. But as Cristina noted, there is this erosion on the home front here in the state where Democrats and no party preference folks are showing a little bit more shakiness or uncertainty about how they think about state officials. And I think that is a cause for concern.
No, I understand that. So, I'm wondering, before I want to talk first, we really get into the political dimensions of the coronavirus here in California. But when you talk about polarization, you're talking about some surprising results. Is that just sort of, do you think, part of normal political trends? Or is the virus shaking the ground under everyone to some extent, Eric?
To be honest, I would say the surprising thing is the extent to which the virus hasn't shaken the ground in a fundamental sense, in a big structural way, in terms of, ordinarily you would think this kind of a major crisis of public health might lead to some kind of reshuffling or bipartisan kind of consensus on sort of core public health issues, like, for example, whether to embrace a vaccine that may protect us against it. And yet we see really polarized views on so many public health measures. So I think, to me, that, maybe I shouldn't be surprised about it given everything that's happened, but that I do think it is at least somewhat surprising.
Yeah.
And I will say it's grown. I mean, when we first went into the field asking people about COVID in April of last year, there was surprisingly very little difference between Democrats and Republicans on wearing a mask. This was actually before Donald Trump came out with sort of this, refusal to wear a mask and sort of equivocating back and forth on the issue. In July, you start to see that split between Democrats and Republicans grow bigger. In October, you saw it bigger. This is the biggest split that we've seen, upwards of 30, 40 point difference between Democrats and Republicans on the importance of wearing a mask. Whereas remember in April, there was very little difference. Now there was a difference on how serious the virus was or things like that. But when you think about the way that ideology then filters into the way you're going to think about your personal practice and safety and behavior, I mean, we're just seeing sort of the way the split is filtering into sort of everyday practice too.
So let's stay with that subject for a second, because I'm looking at the headline from one of the press releases you guys put out, the troubling political dimension of the coronavirus in California. I mean, 10 years ago, I don't think I would have ever seen it. What do you mean a political dimension to a pandemic? What kind of political dimension could there be? We might have thought 10 years ago. So what the heck is happening that issues around science and whether to wear a mask and whether to be involved in social distancing and things that seem the epitome of apolitical issues, what's happening that they've become political, do you think? Cristina.
I think it started with the Trump administration and sort of really taking a stance when many would have argued that no political stance would have been necessary, at least to that extent, right? So when we recall, for example, criticisms of the CDC or Fauci, or even the issue of a mask, right, of being sort of politicized instead of a moment of coming together to fight together for these things. So when you see it at the height of a national office, I mean, we saw, for example, in April and in July, in the survey that whether or not Trump approval was the biggest filter that Californians were using to even think about whether the virus was real and whether you could trust the World Health Organization, the CDC, things of the sort. So it's quite amazing how quickly things became partisan. And I think part of this, had to do with the previous administration and their willingness, on one side and the other to make it a partisan issue.
Yeah, Eric, what's your take on this? Because, I'm noting and thinking that one of the findings was that 64% of voters statewide said they'd be very likely to get vaccinated, but only 44% of Republicans said they'd be very likely to get vaccinated. But at the same time, my impression is, based on coverage, is that vaccine skepticism is bipartisan. So how do you make sense out of these numbers around the pandemic and the politicization of related issues?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I would say that there's a longer term trend of more and more things becoming partisan and ideological, as the country's polarized. In the 1990s, rise of Newt Gingrich, in the 2000s, Bush v. Gore, and so on. But then I think what happened is with President Trump, it kind of went on steroids in a sense. It went to an even greater extent. And so I think the real, and especially it's interesting on science, because as you know, the sort of skepticism of science has been a bipartisan phenomenon. But we hadn't had before now a president who so clearly kind of articulated a skepticism of science. And with him being identified so firmly with republicanism, that serves as a cue for Republican voters and has kind of shifted them in that direction. I think the real interesting question is, had there been a, Jeb Bush or a Rubio or a different Republican president who'd responded differently to the virus, I think my sense is that would have caused at least a fair number of Republicans to have, followed that cue, and so we wouldn't have had quite as sharp a polarization as we're seeing.
I will say that one thing about California and thinking about the vaccine, right, which is a little bit different than thinking about the virus, right? The numbers aren't sort of as polarized. And one of the reasons I think is if you're looking at California and who Democrats are a much more multiracial umbrella, right, than what we're seeing, a much more whiter Republican umbrella, a Republican base in California. And if you look at the numbers for people of color, especially for Latinos and Blacks, their sort of ability to trust, in a vaccine or to see a vaccine as a solution is not as strong, for example, as among sort of white Democrats. And I think that's really important. That speaks to a long history of sort of trust in government, trust in medicine, trust in science amongst these communities. If you think back to the Tuskegee experiments, or if you think back with Latinx populations and their relationship to sort of state services, state medical services, right? And fears of deportation or fears of being seen as a public charge or things like that. All of these things are getting meshed in together. And now it's not just about, can I maintain myself from 6 feet, but now I must trust myself to an entity, go to it and have something injected inside of me. I mean, part of that might also be, whether California, whether the nation, right? This is just not a California trend, but POC numbers and trust in the vaccine lag nationally. Whether entities are actually doing an adequate job of tailoring the message, right? Getting to communities this idea of you can trust the government that this is the response, that this will keep you safe. It becomes very visceral and very personal when it's about, a vaccine now.
Yeah, Cristina, I want to move on next to the findings around Governor Newsom. Before I do, I'm just wondering if there were other data in the pandemic part of the poll relating to racial differences and disparities that jumped out to you.
Yeah, so I mean, if we think that the political numbers have exacerbated, we also see that the racial numbers are consistent and even higher too. I mean, once again, the number of, for example, Latinos that say that the virus has led to reduced wages or reduced workout hours is 71% versus the number for whites is 36%. Wow. It's a huge spread. It's a 35-point spread. The number of Latinos that say that they're having trouble meeting their basic needs today because of the virus is 65 versus 27% of white. Wow. I mean, there is no question that this is a racial equity issue. There's no question that if I think of the virus, I think about its political dimensions, and it would be folly not to think, and harmful not to think about it as in racial dimensions. And what we're seeing is, it's not as if racial equality was there before, right? But what we're seeing, just like what we saw with political polarization that Eric described, is sort of this effect, this massive effect of the virus of exacerbating the inequalities that were even there. If we think, for example, of just even small businesses, right? Thinking about which small businesses have been impacted. If we think of immigrant communities and the way the second generation is the most entrepreneurial group in California, sons and daughters of Asian, Latinx immigrants, for example, but they're less likely to also have assets and savings to weather the effects of this. And so if you're thinking about it at the bottom, like how it's affecting the poor, if you're thinking about a middle class and how it's affecting this all has both a racial and political dimension that bears repeating and repeating because the numbers are becoming much more stark.
Got it. Wow, fascinating. We've got 3 other areas we want to explore, and Erica, I want you to take us through the polls related to Governor Newsom's performance. Bad news for the governor, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, certainly concerning news for the governor. I mean, when we had been in the field in September, his approval rating was quite high, and it seemed like solid support. And there's some real erosion in our poll where his approved, disapproved numbers are now a little bit underwater. And when we ask about the recall, while it is the case that more voters think it's a bad idea to do the recall than a good idea, when they're asked how they would vote in the recall, about 45% say they would vote against recalling the governor. About 36% say they'd vote in favor, and then a whole lot of voters are undecided. And that's, I think that's really, has to be concerning because, you want to be above 50%. That's, in this kind of polling. And when we delve in a little closer, what we see is a lot of Democrats and a lot of no party preference folks who are in that undecided category. And a lot of these are folks who had been supportive of the governor, but as Cristina was noting, have been really concerned, especially about the pandemic and this uneven or inconsistent state response or sense of a state response. And we think that's really eroded the governor's support and made him vulnerable in a way that just wouldn't have seemed at all realistic 6 months ago.
And is there any way that you can assess from the numbers, is this just something endemic to the pandemic, meaning politicians confronting this crazy situation and, the vaccine rollout that was sort of federalized without a national plan? Is it just a really bad time to be a governor of a big state? Or what are you seeing in the poll? Are there some legitimate issues here that suggest there have been some failures in Sacramento?
I think if you look at, we asked on the poll what sort of adjectives folks would use to describe the governor's handling of the pandemic, and inconsistent was by far the biggest adjective used. And so that's frustrating, right? Voters want to have a sense of where they think the elected officials stand. And when they sort of waffle back and forth, that's almost worse than sort of some expectation that you actually don't want to have. So I think that's one. Another thing that we've been discussing earlier is just there's no Trump right now, right? There's no Trump foil, right? If you look at our numbers in April, weren't they even like quite heroic, Eric? The perception of Newsom back in April was through the roof. I mean, through the roof, right? And part of that is because the numbers for Trump were so down, right? And so folks were looking for a savior, someone to go through, right? And now there is no Trump to go through, one. And two, Newsom actually has to do something, right? He's lots of, aside from these big debates of open up, not open up, he has to just roll out the vaccine. And if you're inconsistent and being seen as unfair, out of touch, not sort of there, I mean, that coupled with, the dinners.
Dinners at the French Laundry can't help.
Yeah.
Got it. So
right. Though I mean, the one thing I'd say is in his favor, though, is that ultimately a lot's going to depend on how this response goes, right? So in other words, he's being penalized now because I think there's this sense of frustration. The pace of the vaccine rollout when we were in the field with the continuing restrictions, the cases had gone way up in California earlier in the year. And so restrictions came back on, and it seemed like a sort of back and forth kind of policy situation. But if the governor, working with other, the localities and other actors, succeeds in the vaccine rollout or seen as succeeding, if cases continue to go down, if the economy gradually reopens, I don't think we're seeing a solidification of anti-Newsom views. But what we're seeing is, it's a lot's going to depend on essentially his performance and success, or the state's success. And if it works in policy terms, I think these are not voters who've turned on him for good. But on the other hand, if it doesn't work, if it continues to seem inconsistent, as Cristina said, and voters continue to be frustrated, then he is in real trouble.
We're going to take a question now that came in from the audience, and I'll just remind people, if you want to post a question, use the comment section on the YouTube site where this is being streamed from. So one of the questions that came in, Eric, is what would be the likely result if the recall Newsom movement is effective? Who do you think might take his place? Who would be a front runner? How does that look to you? How would it impact, the vaccine rollouts is what this person is asking.
Yeah, it would be on the one hand, the recall going forward would clearly be a major distraction. On the other hand, for now, the threat of the recall, the governor has been out there, all over the state in the last few weeks, working with local officials, pushing a strong message. So it may be that the threat may be constructive in some ways. The reality, if it comes to pass, I think, there are certainly downsides. And then I think in the recall, a big question will be, the Trump wing of the Republican Party. There's some sort of quote MAGA-oriented candidates who are making noises. There are also some more conventional Republicans like Faulconer from San Diego who've been thinking about a run. So there'll be a battle, who's the alternative? And I think to the extent that there isn't a clear alternative, a la Arnold Schwarzenegger in that earlier recall, that would probably help Newsom if there's nobody that folks are coalescing around.
Got it. Let's turn to the next part of the poll, and that had to do with perceptions of other California politicians, and chief among them, Senator Dianne Feinstein, where once again appeared to be some bad tidings in that poll. Cristina, can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, since we've been polling, it seems like her numbers are more underwater than above. And that was a big surprise, right? But maybe it's not, for two reasons, right? One is maybe just those that are in office right now are having a hard time with the virus, period, right? Voters want to be mad at someone. They need to be, and right now Trump's not there. And things are still bad in California. So who do we turn to? We turn to Newsom. We also turn to Feinstein, things of the sort. Two, the Coney Barrett, hearings video was sparked off a huge outcry on social media, everywhere, among organizations.
Phil, for people who may not have seen that, just a really quick encapsulation of how that involved Senator Feinstein.
Yeah, I mean, it was a real quick shot with not much content of her thanking Lindsey Graham for having conducted sort of a swift and just sort of thanking him after the Coney Barrett hearings, right, for I don't think the word was fair, but sort of a swift hearing process. And I think that was jarring, right, for many Californians in an era of political polarization. You don't want to see that, right? You don't want to see that who you think is on your side is sort of thanking and being okay with an entire process that many Californians weren't on board with, right? And so in that, this is the first time we've surveyed about her since 2017, but also one of the first surveys since that those videos came out. And so that, I think, didn't sit well at a moment when, sort of right after the election, all the debates came about who should be the next senator, right? So this just started with more conversations of what we want in the senator, who we need representing California, which then allowed for a big sort of contingent of younger voters, people of color, sort of coming out and saying, we are multiracial California, we need a new vision of who's supporting us. All of these arguments were out there and were debated in LA Times, the Chronicle, the Sacramento. So we started to have these arguments about what does a new vision of sort of national leadership mean for California? And you still had Feinstein, right? And so the Feinstein cachet of, I've been here for a long time, you've known me, things of the sort, suddenly didn't start to sit well. So I think you have those two things, right? And, those debates were really big. It took a while for Padilla to be announced as the new senator, right? So it allowed for a long time for people to have these arguments and to put these arguments out there about what California needs. And increasingly, that became a more multiracial, younger California argument that doesn't seem to be necessarily in line with the vision of what Feinstein is doing.
So speaking of other politicians, Eric, how did our newest senator, Senator Alex Padilla, how did he make out? And what about other notable political figures in the state? How are they doing these days?
Yeah, I mean, so Padilla's numbers were much more favorable than Feinstein's. There was also a lot of non-opinionation, like in other words, a lot of people who don't know. So he had good favorable numbers, relatively low unfavorable, and then a fair number, perhaps a surprising number given how his visibility in the state up till now, of no opinion responses. We saw something similar for Javier Becerra, who's has been a senior figure in the state already and is now going to be in the Biden cabinet. And again, high favorability, relatively low unfavorable, a lot of lack of opinionation. I guess what I would say about that is, we're all kind of political junkies and we know the whole cast of characters. But California is such a big, vast, diverse, busy state that it's striking how somebody can be such an important figure in the state for some time. And there's still plenty of Californians who don't yet have a strong view.
And given that Badi is, going to have an election in about, 2 years or so, these are really important figures for him to pay attention to, right? It's about him now having the opportunity to stake the narrative. This is who I am. It really is a project of him introducing himself, even though he's been in California statewide legislator for a long time, of introducing himself as senator, as an agenda. And he's been very busy on media since he's on CNN, he's on lots of national media, he's on the sort of immigration committees and things of the sort that I think perhaps it's his way of crafting himself to California. Right, he has to present himself now as the national figure to California in order for these sort of numbers of no opinion to go down in time for the next election.
So let me share an interesting question just came in from somebody who's watching. It says, how can we as educators help decrease the rampant personalization or anthropomorphizing of policy agendas? The quote, Newsom won't let me drink, or quote, Cuomo hates my grandmother, that seems to be taking over public discourse. How can we get back to the notions of common causes and policies for the common weal? What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, it's a deep question. I think that certainly when I teach, so I teach a course on U.S. Congress, an undergraduate course here, and try to emphasize thinking about the role of institutions, of kind of broader structures that are shaping incentives of these actors. And so that if we as citizens want to change what they do, it's not necessarily about getting the heroic figure in or the evil figure out, but finding ways to exert pressure to change their incentives regardless of who it is. To see that, for example, voters are looking for something and will actually vote on that basis, or be activist and work for candidates on that basis. And hopefully in the long run, that helps, kind of shift the perspective away from, oh, this is all about, Nancy Pelosi, or this is all about, some other figure that becomes the boogeyman for one side.
Got it.
I think one way too is just talking about the dangers of personalizing on these ways, and even perhaps calling politicians out when they do this. I mean, and this has been going on for a long time, right? It was like with healthcare death panels and what's going to happen to grandma and, things of the sort. And so there's some factions of political officials that or elected officials that do this more than others. And maybe even just starting the conversation of how this is harmful, I think might be a way we might start thinking about it, especially if it's an educator in high school and civic classes and things of the sort, right? Might be sort of worth thinking about, just sort of this being a staple part of the way people come to get to know an education about what is government, what is civics.
Got it. So we only have a very few minutes left, and we're gonna get to the very last part of the poll. Shocking that the bluest of blue states of California, they're okay with President Joe Biden. Cristina, any surprises there? Anything that you want to call out around the fact that Joe Biden is enjoying a 2-to-1 margin in terms of favorable opinion in the great state of California?
Everyone likes Joe right now. He's done, so one thing to think about is this is somewhat surprising given that he didn't do the greatest in the primaries, right?
That's
in
right.
California, this was a Bernie Sanders state. And now very quickly, this is folks are good with Joe. You see one trend that you've seen nationally is, especially in California, Black communities are especially favorable. Black Californians are especially favorable on Joe, much more than others. While other groups are roughly about 2/3 in favor for Joe, 3/4 of African Americans in the state are in favor for Joe. So you see some of these national trends map onto California, and folks are really excited about their picks. I mean, you got Becerra, you got Harris. Some folks are seeing a real California representation in Joe's administration, and that makes some. When we started in the beginning with folks are seeing hope. I think that's what's giving them some hope. This is, at least for them, an administration that seems to, taking California seriously, perhaps. I don't know if you see other.
Sorry, Eric?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And then I guess though, one thing to note is when we ask them about issues that concern them, you get, the pandemic, racial justice among Democrats are two really important issues. We ask how optimistic are they that they'll make progress on it. And there's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of, as Cristina was saying, hope that real substantive progress will be made. And so I guess you can think of that as both the opportunity and challenge for Biden, right? This hopefulness is why people are so supportive right now. It does mean there's pressure to deliver, in a very deeply divided country, to substantive change on issues that his voters care about. And so, he'll be held to account for that, I think, over time. But that's really how I would view the message of our poll on that score.
At least in California, he does have a honeymoon stage.
Very nice. Last question for both of you, and it's kind of a meta question. We've talked about politicization of everything, and it seems, in the wake of the presidential election, a lot of chest beating or, Sturm und Drang about polling itself, that we're now seeing perhaps political differences in how people respond and whether conservatives will respond. What's happening to your business? Are you concerned that the very idea of accurate polling is something that's going out the window, Cristina?
Oh, I'm going to give this to Eric.
Yeah, I've nerded out on the poll stuff for a while. So first, I would say we have a lot of confidence. Our polls, the person who leads our polling effort, Mark DiCamillo, has been the kind of dean of California polling at the field poll for a long time and just knows this. It's really important to know the state that you're polling, because that that gives you a sense for whether this sample is good or not. So I want to say that first. I will say, like everybody else, we have that challenge. We find Republicans and conservatives, and especially Trump Republicans, are less likely to respond to surveys. And so in our polling, we do everything we can to get a high response rate, and which we did. We're really thrilled with this poll, over 10,000 respondents. And also, though, in our weighting of the poll to try to adjust for that. And one thing in this particular poll, I noticed our numbers for Newsom were a little less positive than another pollster's numbers for Newsom. And one thing that I'd note about our poll is we weighted the poll to the 2020 presidential results. In other words, our share of Trump supporters in our poll is the same as turned out to vote for Trump. And that's very intentional, because what you worry about is those Trump supporters who showed up to vote are less likely to respond to polls. And if you're not waiting for that, there's a risk that even waiting for republicanism doesn't quite do it, because these are a particular segment of Republicans. So I feel confident in our poll, but confident only in the sense that every time it's a work in progress, and it takes that kind of expertise that Mark and others bring to it to really be very careful in thinking, is our sample, what are the dangers in our sample, and how can we do the best possible to try to correct for it and limit that?
And I do think there's something to say for the online format that the IGS poll has. Mark is certainly a pioneer in online formats, and there is something to say about being able to talk about things like what you think about the police, what you think about Black Lives Matter, which are questions that we've had, and give people the sort of privacy to do it in an online poll, which is how we see some of our results, versus telling someone over the phone. And then even just thinking about who's answering their cell phone these days, right? With a number that they don't see, who's answering marketers' calls. And so none of these are perfect, right? We've been fortunate to work with someone, with Mark DiCamillo, who's been sort of at the field thinking about these in cutting edge ways. And, as an academic unit, it's our goal to just give the best picture that we can using the cutting edge research that we know and the tools in social science that we can marshal to give the best picture. But, this is one snapshot in time. It'll change in about 3 months, and, we'll be back here again talking about those changes, I guess.
And with that, we need to end our own little snapshot in time to talk about all this. As usual, you guys are filled with really fascinating stuff. It's amazing to hold that the mirror up to public opinion and perceptions in these days, these complicated days we're living in. So Eric and Cristina, thank you very much for joining us today and for the good work you're doing for your students, for the people of California. And thanks to everybody who joined us for this Berkeley conversation. Hope you have a great weekend and stay safe and be well. Thanks again.